I have my panel here alongside me. I'm Alastair Leake. I work for the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, and we are going to be discussing revenue and resilience this morning. Now, I have to say, through my career, I've always looked for ways in which we can make money from more than just growing the food that we produce. I was involved in glasshouse salad crops for a long time, and we opened a farm shop to add some value to that. Later on, I moved on to a vegetable farm, and we went organic to try and get some more money that way. And I currently look after the Allerton project, which is a research and demonstration farm in Leicestershire, where we're notable really most probably for doubling our songbirds, which means we have a fantastic dawn chorus. But I've yet to monetize that, so I'm looking to the team here to come up with ideas as to how I sell my dawn chorus to the general public. Okay, so allow me to introduce my panel. I'll let them introduce themselves because they know themselves far better than me. And opening the session this morning is Digby from Natural Capital Advisory. Digby, over to you.
Thank you, Alastair. So I'm just going to go. So I'm Digby Sowerby. I work for Natural Capital Advisory, and we provide the executive function for the Environmental Farmers Group, Peakland Environmental Farmers, and Swaledale and Wensleydale Environmental Farmers. And I'm just going to run over a little bit an introduction on why we think it's important to work together in these markets, an overview of how we see the markets in sort of simple terms, and then breaking down how we see stacking and bundling and how that works within markets, because I think that's the main theme of the presentation. And then I'll hand over to Tom.
I'm Tom Knowles from Village Farm. We're a family farm in South Oxfordshire, so about an hour or so from here. And yeah, I'll be talking about what we're doing with SFIs and other bits and bobs throughout.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm Matt Clegg. I work for Binnies. We're an engineering and environmental consultancy focusing on the water and environment sectors. And I'm going to just cover some of the projects and case studies that we've been working on to develop solutions which relate to natural capital, farming, and more sustainable land use as well.
Very good. Well, open us up then, Digby.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to start with what Natural Capital Advisory is very quickly. So we're essentially an advisory and broking service to help support farmers in natural capital markets to deliver environmental change and earn fair financial reward for delivering that. We provide, as I mentioned, the executive function for 3 farmer cooperative groups, the Environmental Farmers Group, which covers about 150 farmers, 70,000 hectares, and then Peakland Environmental Farmers and Swaledale and Wensleydale Environmental Farmers as well. And combined, they cover about 4% of England's farmed area. And I think the main message I wanted to get across really is that scale is so imperative, we feel, in these markets. The reason why we think scale is important is because farmers control 72% of England, UK's farmed area. We've all heard that stat before. And if the government wants to meet its environmental targets, it's not going to be able to do that on its 8% of land area managed for nature. And so farmers are going to have to contribute, and we need to understand how farmers are going to be able to earn the return. And we think the cooperative model provides real benefits for the environment, for farmers, and for investors and buyers. So the main thing for the environment is, of course, the scale, so the ability to be able to make an impact on a landscape scale and be able to measure that. So through our system, we're looking to create catchment conservation plans where we're measuring and baselining the carbon, biodiversity and water on a landscape scale, but from the bottom up. And that gives us an ability to track and monitor the change that's been delivered over time, that we can then prove to investors, buyers, government, or whoever the change that's been delivered. For farmers, really, it's access to new income streams, particularly from a perspective of being able to access more opportunities, because we have this sort of gravitational model whereby the scale brings in more opportunities to us. And then secondly, also being able to earn greater income from a natural capital trade, because you've got the buying power of a cooperative there. And then finally, for investors and buyers, their key point in talking to us is looking at that single professional point of contact, trusted point of contact, and then having sufficient scale to be able to deliver their requirement. So, for example, we have buyers who are looking to buy hundreds of thousands of tons worth of carbon, which you just can't do on a small individual farm scale. In terms of the markets overview, this is the sort of the three blobs that we always use to try and describe how we see the market sitting. I'm going to start with green, and then I'm going to go to the red, and then talk about the one in the middle. So we have statutory markets, and we think the two main markets operating in the statutory market is biodiversity net gain, which I think most people will have heard about, and then nutrient neutrality, which some people would have heard about. Biodiversity net gain, of course, is 10% on any houses built across any part of England. And then nutrient neutrality is only specific to certain water catchments which are particularly sensitive to phosphate and nitrate within parts of England. We think these are sort of the apprentice market. They are quite slow and clunky, but there's some opportunities for farmers where they're sort of prepared enough to be able to go into them. Again, scale offers a great benefit of being able to enter those markets because you're able to look at supply and demand in an area and be able to manage that more appropriately. So I'm going to go to the red one, which is the voluntary markets. And so the main two markets within this are carbon and nature and water. That's three. Carbon, for a start, I think we've all heard about the carbon markets. There's high demand for carbon at the moment and high quality carbon. However, it's very difficult to get everyone to agree on the methodology in which we use to measure that carbon and therefore be able to provide a trusted product to market. But we think it's getting there, and it's very, very close to being a real financial opportunity to farmers. Nature markets are much more nascent. They're driven by corporate reporting frameworks where companies have to report on their impact on nature. And so these we think are potentially really this is the big opportunity, but it's very, very early days. And so, for example, I heard an example of one of these trades so far where Amazon Web Services are paying a group of farmers to plant trees and cover crops to hold more water in the ground, and they can directly offset the water they're using to cool their data centers to be able to use that as direct offset. So they can say that they're mitigating their impact on the environment because they're replacing the water that's been otherwise lost down into the rivers. And then finally, we've got investors. And so investors are interesting players, and they operate in both markets. And really, there can be benefits from farmers for working with investors because they can reduce the risk of entering the markets. But of course, they're looking for a return on the back of it. And so you have to be very wary when you're talking to investors about the deal you're going to get. So that's sort of an overview of the markets. And now I'll go into ecosystem services, as the terminology is used, and stacking, and the principles behind stacking and unbundling in the market. So the theory of natural capital is that you have an ecosystem and you have ecosystem services. So for an example of woodland, 1 hectare of woodland would be an ecosystem, and then within that 1 hectare of woodland, you're producing multiple ecosystem services. So you're creating your biodiversity, your clean air, your carbon capture, public access, etc. And then each of those ecosystem services can potentially be monetized via demand from certain markets. And the idea is that by splitting out the ecosystem services, you can provide those to various markets. And so really, it's not the ecosystem that you're looking to monetize, it's the ecosystem service within that ecosystem. And we've got certain frameworks that are coming out to be able to support farmers in being able to access income opportunities for providing those ecosystem services. So for example, we've got biodiversity net gain, nutrient neutrality, which is all managed by Natural England. And then we've got peatland code and woodland carbon code, which are becoming more and more accepted measures. And then in terms of stacking and bundling, this is about how do you monetize those ecosystem services. So stacking is the idea that you can measure each of the ecosystem services and you sell them independently to different markets. So you could sell your biodiversity to your housing developer, and you can sell your carbon to your corporate, for example. And then bundling is slightly different, where you measure each of those ecosystem services that have been provided, but you bundle them and sell them in one credit. So this might be a high quality carbon credit, for example. And so what is my advice to farmers, or our main sort of takeaways for farmers that I want to get across? Firstly, in the statutory markets, I think biodiversity net gain and nutrient neutrality, there are opportunities here, but you have to have a really clear understanding of the market in your area, your location. The size of your project might be relevant as well. Again, that's why working at scale can sometimes be better, because you can minimize the impact on each individual farm. and the productivity of each of those farms. But also, it's definitely worth considering investors in these opportunities because the costs to start up are really, really high. So, I mean, I've been costing out some biodiversity net gain projects, and you're looking at between £30,000 and £150,000 to get a project off the ground, based on the monitoring costs over the 30 years and whether they're paid up front or not. Going to the investors, like I say, assess your options. There's a few different options out there, and the return that's been taken is really important. So some providers will take a massive return, which just doesn't seem fair, and then others, of course, are going to take a more reasonable return. And so just looking at the options out there, making sure the terms are fine. And then for the voluntary markets, I think our main message at the moment is there is a financial opportunity with carbon. We think there's a legitimate, trusted financial opportunity with carbon, but be really careful, tread carefully. Firstly, get to net zero or understand how you're going to get to net zero yourself before you sell carbon. That's going to be critical, especially when trying to supply your buyers. And you are able to stack these opportunities with SFI at the moment. So you are able to stack carbon on top of any SFI payments. For the moment, I meant to say for BNG and nutrient neutrality, you can stack those over the same parcel of land. And so I've actually missed my main point on here, but you want to try and maximize the amount of stacking you can do on that particular area because it's long-term agreements. So these are 30, 80 years agreements. So you really want to maximize the income you're getting over that parcel of land. And then the final word I'd say is baselining, I think, is critical because baselining today will provide evidence for you in the future. So, for example, if you want to do a biodiversity net gain project, you can backdate your baseline up until 31st January 2020. So you can use any data that you got back then to then create a BNG project. So you can be confident to go and plant a hedge or create a biodiversity project and still be able to backdate those measurements. And I think that's me.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Digby. So thanks, Digby. That's given us a good introduction to the markets out there and how we might stack and bundle, the importance of working at scale and aggregation. But I'm going to go over to Tom now. Tom, how are you going to perform in this environment? What's your view? What's your vision? And what are you going to do?
Right. Thank you, everyone. As I said before, we're a 150 hectare farm, mixed farm, South Oxfordshire, about 60 hectares arable, 90 pasture, heavy ground, nitrate vulnerability zone. So perhaps that's a nutrient neutrality consideration. We were a dairy until 21 with the arable as a second business. Then we've now closed that down and the arable is our main business. And we've got a grazing license for a neighbour, 150 beef cattle. And since October 22, we've been doing biochropping with Wild Farm. That, in a sense, we'll get onto a bit later, is an area where there is a good area to stack SFIs in particular, but perhaps further down the line, carbon issues as well. So essentially, we're looking at the SFIs as something that we need to really exceed what we get from BPS, fit it to our system, and then that will create a greater resilience for the business and the land overall, all while still growing food. So the history of what we've done is that prior to 21, we were sort of sporadic, small-scale environmental schemes, mostly related to the milk contracts that we had. Then subsequently in autumn 21, we installed quite a large scheme, so about a sixth of the property, and that was mostly for integrated pest management purposes. And then we took a lot of capital fencing as well. Then we did the SFI 22 for soils, which has subsequently closed, as everyone will recognise. Then 23, we did another SFIs, again for integrated pest management, hedgerows, and we joined the cluster landscape recovery bid, which has subsequently been successful and about to kick off this month. And then this year we've done another countryside stewardship where we've got educational visits, which might go towards Alastair's way of monetising the Dawn Chorus. And then we've looking at summer, the 24 SFIs for heritage, archaeology, low inputs, ditches, ponds, and potentially some precision options. And then further down the line, we'll look at things like public access. We'll reevaluate where we are when the 21 countryside stewardship scheme comes to an end, see what's working, what needs improving, and potentially after this really wet winter, we've identified some areas that perhaps they might do well with a pond, and look at more capital grants for various things as well. So now to go into a bit more specifics, the baseline for BPS was about 220 an hectare. We're looking to exceed that. So in our arable section, you can see on the plan there, the yellow bits are pollinator and bird margins. The blue is the old SW1 grass margins. The green are herbal ley, and down in the bottom, or the top right, there's a green section there, and that's a winter ryegrass for birdseed as well. Those have all generally worked quite well. There's a bit of an issue with grazing on the SW1s, the CAHL3 margin, but we've got that in hand and we'll work that out. Now with the wild farm bit that we're doing, which is low input arable, we've been stacking the soil and the cover crops. We've also got the companion crop and the no pesticides going the IPMs there. But as of this coming 24 SFIs, we'll be able to switch that out and get the 354 pounds a hectare for the low input cereals, that's a total game changer for mine, really. Now in the grazing section, we've taken half hectares out. They're the brown sections, and we've done some herbal lays. We've recently put in the low input grazing on a few fields, and then obviously hedgerows. And we've got right down the bottom centre of the screen there, we've got essentially a set-aside field. It's a small grazing field that's surrounded by arable, and at the moment we haven't got integrated the livestock that much to get all the way around there. So, yeah, we've basically set that aside for the moment. And then we're doing the educational visits. So at the moment, we're about £310 per hectare with those SFIs and stewardship payments. Looking to the future, we're looking at the precision farming options, so no-till, the variable rate fertiliser. I've got some questions about how you might need to do that. We don't have high-tech equipment, and perhaps many of you don't. So how much of a field do you need to sample to determine variable rate is a question that I have. We'll look at summer cover cropping, low input grazing, and further herbal lays. And then we've also got options on some old buildings for the heritage. And then we have a medieval shrunken village on one of the fields. So that we could potentially look at that for archaeological preservation there. And then, as I mentioned before, ponds, pond buffer zones, and then we'll look at ditches, and perhaps pushing the boat out a bit is the agroforestry options for relay cropping. So here I've got a table of some ideas that I've sort of put out there. So if we start from the bottom of the table there, the BPS equivalent is 220 a hectare. Currently we're at 310, but that doesn't include anything from the summer's SFI 24 yet. Our basic, what we think we can include from SFI 24 would, but excluding educational visits, because many of you won't want to do those, we're about 420 a hectare. If we include the education visits, that pushes it to 480 a hectare, and I think that's quite a realistic option. If we stretch ourselves a bit with no-till and summer cover crops, that gets it up to 510 a hectare. And then if we go down agroforestry and more unharvested cereal break crops where we have problem areas, then we can get up to about 560 a hectare. So that's really quite a big improvement on BPS. And then I'll just touch on a couple of other things to do. So we've looked at, in the past, we've done a fair bit of fencing with capital grants. We're looking at water tank infrastructure for saving water. And there's various options there, the piping the tanks and the filters. Then that can be used for when the animals are in the barn. And then we historically had slurry infrastructure, so that's another option for people that have that. Solar we would have looked at, but we've already done that. Machinery is another option, and my big consideration for that is we're a medium to smaller size farm, so perhaps a collaboration on that is more of an option than outright buying the equipment ourselves. But obviously that involves agreements with other people. And then drones and drills. I mean, over the wet winter, who hasn't thought about seeding via a drone? And then now pushing on to a wider issues that might add value with the wild farm biochropping that we've been doing. We've been involved in all the trials that they've got. The carbon and biodiversity accounting, the draft results for that are quite good, indicating that the biochropping is a carbon sink as opposed to conventional, which is a carbon source. So, yeah, or carbon dioxide source. So that's positive. The other biodiversity indicators, we're waiting on the results, but we should get them soon. And we've been doing other projects related to land use opportunities and agroforestry and forestry opportunities. And as I said before, we're involved in the landscape recovery bid, so that potentially will help with water-friendly farming in our area, nutrient neutrality, biodiversity net gain, and maybe carbon offsetting, linking it with more of the other farmers in a larger area. And so, yeah, in summary, there's plenty of opportunities there. Many are really reachable, easy to do, and link with an existing farming system. And so for mine, £400 a hectare is reachable, 500 is possible. And yeah, as long as you match it with your system, then you're well on the way to sort of firming up your the resilience of your business. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Before I go on to Matt, just a quick. Obviously, huge amount of work put in there into tapping into the public money. And I think what you've shown very clearly there is how much there is available if you put your mind to it. Going forward, what private trades and, tapping into other areas, how have you managed to focus at all on that?
Say that again.
Going forward, private trades rather than getting your income solely from the public purse, which is basically what we're looking at.
Yeah, exactly. I think I think we'll look at those options through the farm cluster and the landscape recovery project as an in, because we'll get expert advice through that. I think we've been dipping our toe in the water of what's out there and trying to baseline and things at the moment. So I'll always keep my ear to the ground for options. But yeah, I feel that perhaps, as you'd said, that we're likely, as a small farm, it will be tricky, and that perhaps the barrier to entry is a bit too high. But as a farming cluster or a wider group of farmers, then the options start to open up that way. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. Okay, final piece of the jigsaw then, please. Over to Matt.
Thanks, Alastair. I think it's the first time I've been called that, but I'll take that as a good bit. So I'm Matt Clegg. I'm Environment Director for Binnies. We're, as I said at the start, we're an environmental and engineering company. We do consultancy, we do delivery, so on the ground stuff, and we also do the management, verification, asset management kind of stuff in the water and environment sectors. And I just wanted to kind of highlight the slightly different approach I think sometimes we take in this. We work for the Environment Agency, we work for the water companies, we work with the Rivers Trust and the Wildlife Trust, and we also work for private estate owners. And we really try and focus how we approach this on a kind of solution development basis. So what are we trying to solve? What vision do people have? What are the problems that we have in the landscapes, in the farms, in the catchments, etc.? And really try to build up that in a solution-focused way, understanding what's there, and at each stage looking to value what we have at the moment and the uplift that we can actually provide in terms of natural capital and resilience as we do that. And we find that really works well in the way that we can develop options and perhaps make the management of landscapes and farms more resilient in the future. So there's a bit of a convoluted set of diagrams there, but effectively the diagram on the left shows our approach to that, and the kind of diagram on the right is really about how we integrate the natural capital approach within that, and it's very data and evidence driven. So just a quick note on how we value the solutions in doing that. So we value it on kind of at 3 levels, well 5 levels as shown in this the concentric circles there. And the coloured circles really show what we're able to value in terms of quantification and monetary value. And we use those principles looking at economic welfare. So what's the value that these schemes can provide to the public good? And that might relate to grant funding. We look at it from a market value perspective. So the developing markets that Digby and Tom have touched upon in terms of BNG and nutrient neutrality and the carbon credits. And then we also look at it from a market price perspective. So it may be BNG, it may be carbon, but it also may be an operator, an infrastructure operator who may have a specific issue where you can tie in a solution on a given piece of land, and that's actually kind of a bespoke agreement that you can set up and design, co-create with that operator, be they water companies, be that national highways, Network Rail, etc. So that's really how we come to it. We try to take this expansive view on it and develop solutions which work with the farming systems and the business, but also can tie in and provide stakeholders and buyers with something which they specifically want. So that's all good in terms of the overall theory of that. Just a couple of case studies really to emphasise that it actually works. So the first one, Chester Wetland Centre. So 20 hectares covering a local country park just to the north of Chester city centre. Ex-landfill and used by the local community, but it's got a few problems with degraded habitats. The local community group which runs the park came to us and said, look, we want to put a wet meadow in, but we've got a problem with water quality that stems from the water that comes from the evocatively titled Finch's Gutter, which runs through the site. High levels of nutrients in there and other nasties from urban runoff, as well as the canal, which you can see in the top left of the picture there. So they said, what can we do? We can look at treatment wetlands upstream that can clean the water. We can create the wet meadow, but how are we going to actually get the money for this? So what we did is we worked with them and the local authority just to do initial kind of vision study, took a natural capital approach, and we valued the benefit that change in water quality and habitat could provide. and came up with a value of £5 million set within this wider green corridor that you can see on the screen that runs from Chester city centre to the Chester Zoo in the north. And what that served to do was provide a prospectus to draw in funding from other sources, so we could align that value with the funding that other people had to achieve similar aims or specific aims that tied in with that as well. Now, the scheme is developed. We're now at the stage where it's going to go in for planning. It's quite a complicated site, so there's quite a lot to do. But by taking a staged process to developing the project, working with the stakeholders, working with the land managers, we've developed a design which maximises the biodiversity units that were created. The scheme's been funded up front by Environment Agency funding, but the back end of it, the capital cost and the future maintenance of that over 30 years is going to be paid for by the biodiversity units and the BNG that's created as a result. And we've also learned quite a few lessons as well as how if you restore rivers, you can open up other opportunities for wider BNG as well. So there's some synergies there. So really good, but okay, this is a farming conference, so let's have a look at a farm. So this is some work we did with the Keasby estate in Lincolnshire. So Simon, the farmer, really keen to understand how he could create a legacy for his future generations and his local community as well. Currently, it's purely arable, maybe not that interesting from a biodiversity perspective at the moment, but his vision on this was that, right, how can I give over, say, a third of my land, create an exemplar sustainable farming system and business, and provide that certainty in future income, but also provide that legacy for my future generation. So a little study that we did with him, we brought in all our ecologists, landscape architects, environmental economists, etc. We got on a virtual whiteboard. We used Miro, and we just got Simon to tell us everything about his farm in the space of 15 minutes. And working through that, through that hour, we came up with 3 options that he could look at from an actual capital and BNG perspective to really understand what he could do and how it might tie in with his farming system as well. So looking at arable margins, looking at patchworks in kind of cut-off areas of fields, looking at perhaps creating mosaics in a core area as well. And the outcomes of that were, again, a kind of little prospectus of what he could do, and not tying him down just to biodiversity net gain, for instance, but understanding what the value was from a woodland carbon perspective or wider natural capital if you want to talk to ESG investors potentially as well. And it gives a narrative, it gives provenance to the scheme as well. So these visualizations we find work very well. So I suppose I wanted to touch upon the stacking and the bundling elements that have been brought up today. And, you know, there's lots of really great work going on. So I just wanted to see how that touches into regenerative agriculture. Now, BNG is based around how do you change, say, land use to create new habitats. And so the habitat types, you go from one habitat type to another, and that generates your biodiversity units. And you also look at how you might manage existing habitats and improve the condition of those habitats. And again, by improving condition, you can generate biodiversity units in the areas that you're looking at. And so from my perspective, and having kind of been involved in Regen Ag for the last 10 years or so, looking at it from a water company and other perspectives, this is what I see as the touch points with Regen Ag and, say, BNG. So, you know, we can integrate trees into the farming system through agroforestry and silvopasture. And again, if you do that in the right way, that can deliver BNG benefit. It's also delivering you a farm business benefit as well if your business is set up around that. You integrate holistic planned grazing or naturalistic grazing. That can also achieve the same outcomes in terms of BNG as well. And I'll touch upon that again in a minute. And then I think the untapped kind of aspect of this is how you look at holistic water planning. There are going to be so many water stresses in the future, both from flooding and from water resources, that, you know, just by planning out in a sustainable way how you manage water within the landscape can actually lead to benefits in terms of greater on-farm storage and use, but it can also provide those features which deliver nutrient neutrality or BNG. So, you know, my message on this is, okay, BNG still developing, and I think Digby's, you know, at the coal face with that as well from the farming perspective. But if you set up your farming system as the foundation and you look at these systems, it means that you will be well placed in the future to take advantage of BNG as that market develops. So, a bit of a what-if scenario, and this is based on Some work we're doing down in the south at the moment with some estates down there, and then also a recent visit that I had in Worcestershire at Croom Court. The picture shows an area where we've baselined stuff for BNG for the UK using the UK hab, and we've got about 60 hectares of moderate modified grassland. So it's quite a low value in terms of what that is for biodiversity units as the starting point, as the baseline. But if you take the naturalistic adaptive grazing approach that's applied at Croom or Kemerton, and I'd direct you to Rob Havard at Fepsom Angus for the detail on that, what you'll find is that those systems can actually achieve profitable livestock businesses, but will also create really good neutral grassland. And if you do that, and that's the basis of your farming system, what you'll find is that having baseline that and move forward into the future, you take that 60 hectare farming scenario, you may well end up with 280, in excess of 280 biodiversity units, which on the scheme of things, and if you look at the DEFRA valuation of what a biodiversity unit is, that's 20 to 25k, that's £5 million. So, how do we look at stacking, not just from the perspective of bundling all the payments together, but how do you stack it with the way that you set your farm business out in the future? And how do we look to do that in a strategic way as well? So that's me.
Okay, thank you very much, panel. So now the work goes out to you guys. I've got 2 roving mics over here. Just put your hand up if you want to ask a question. And if it's targeted at a particular member of the panel, please say so, and we'll be able to answer as efficiently as possible. So, yeah, gentleman there, please.
Good morning. Thanks. For a great panel. Tom, you talked about between £400 and £500 a hectare of gross income for stacking various things. Have you got the cost of delivery of that? Because obviously that's a gross income, and you were making comparisons with BPS where the cost of delivery of that was relatively small. So I'm interested about the contribution to profit from that £400 to £500 a hectare.
Yeah, just in case people didn't hear, I'd given gross accounts, and he's asking for what's the cost of delivering that. We're aiming at things that are mostly within the farming system that we're wanting to do, or relatively low input. So the margins are quite low input. We went with the SW1s initially, the grass margins, because we had a lot of grass being a dairy previously, so that we were there ready to go. There is a possibility for baling the flour margins as well, so you can make some use of that as well. So I think, and looking at the cost of seed and the input, we come out as it's profitable. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to pass the microphone to the front row.
Thank you. Great panel. So thank you for sharing. Just wondering, maybe for Digby, but actually anyone can answer. How do you approach people who have maybe a large exposure to lease land or in farm business tenancies? I think that's obviously often left out as a bit of an elephant in the room when people are talking about natural capital markets.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. It comes up a lot with people we speak to. The main thing we say is that in most contracts, it's not in the contract between the landlord and the tenant. So generally, it's a grown-up conversation between the two. I think naturally, natural capital falls into one or two camps, or is shared between the two camps. So for the 30 to 80 year agreements, that's going to have an effect on the valuation of the land, but also the management of the land. So there's going to be a management element which really belongs with the tenant, and then there's going to be something to do with the overall valuation which belongs with the landlord. So there's probably a sharing sort of thing going on there. And then when you're looking at carbon, that is more to do with production. So I think it would be more relevant to the tenant. But again, it depends on the individual contract between the landlord and the tenant. And so it has to just be a conversation between the two.
Thank you. And one from Tim.
Tim Field, Even Load Landscape Recovery. Matt, you did a brilliant study on AS, which valued our ecosystem service and landscape recovery at around about £7,000 or £8,000 a hectare of value, not necessarily with the price that we're getting in the market at the moment. My question's to Digby around how do we lever some revenue for those habitats that are already high quality? And if we achieve the aims that we need to restore 30 by 30, so on, public purse isn't going to cover that in GS6 or whatever it might be. So have you managed to unlock any finance for existing high quality habitats or natural flood management or anything, any services already provided?
Yeah, fantastic question. And essentially, so we sort of see three sort of statuses. You either have you're creating a new habitat, you're restoring an existing habitat, which is maybe in poor condition, or you're managing an existing high-quality habitat. So those are sort of the three things we distinguish it as. Unfortunately, at the moment, natural capital markets are only going to recognise additionality. So it's creating something new or restoring something that exists already. So really, that's where the market lies at the moment. I think in the longer term, the management side will come, but I almost see it, so DEFRA are talking about this transition from public purse to private purse, and I think it will go down those three systems. So it'll start with creating new, then it'll be restoring, and then it'll be management. And I think they'll transition across to the private sector. However, I think those organisations, those farms who've got a high baseline already, that is a brand. That is a status symbol to say this is how we manage it. And I think that can really be leveraged when we've got scale and we're talking on the sort of the voluntary markets rather than necessarily the statutory markets, which don't recognise it so much. It's not there's no silver bullet, unfortunately, here. Yeah.
Can I ask panel
Do you want to try it?
Just shout it out.
on the Chester and Lincolnshire examples of BNG potential? Can I ask if you actually have a buyer, and then more broadly, does the panel think that the world's a bit over-optimistic about the quantity of BNG that there is out there?
Excuse me. So, from a buyer perspective, Chester is being undertaken in partnership with the local authority. So they are also involved in how that works through the planning system. So I think they're going to point buyers, the developers who need the credits, to the available credits for that, and they are effectively going to be financing the delivery of that project into the future. So it's kind of yes and no. There's a high probability that the credits created will be bought. In terms of Lincolnshire, it was a really kind of a small study. What Simon wanted to do was understand the potential value of that and then use not just the BNG value that could be looked at, but also the other value to engage with investors and keep his options open as the market developed. In terms of BNG supply, supply and demand even, at the moment, it's uncertain. You know, we're at the start of the market, and the first few trades, I understand, it's proving quite tricky because it's a new thing for the local authorities to deal with. But once they're over that hump, I know from the big utility providers that we work with, they're quite concerned about how they source BNG, for instance, for their big capital programs as well. So it's going to be really interesting to see how it unfolds.
And do you mind if I just add on to that? So the government did analysis a couple of years ago about how much demand there'd be, and they were saying there's going to be 6,000 BNG units per annum, roughly, across the whole of England. And if you break that down onto an individual local planning authority, that's relates to about 13 hectares of land per local planning authority per year. So it's relatively small based on that, and that's based on residential developments, really. But I think, as you say, Matt, as we look at larger infrastructure projects which come under the legislation next year, and sort of works by water pipelines and things like this, there's some sort of chunky opportunities that come up here and there. But it's very difficult to understand the supply and demand based on the regional areas.
And just to add to that as well, the other opportunity in the way that we work with those, for instance, the water companies, is you can stack the benefits that the BNG measures actually provide as well. So though you're not implicitly paying or there isn't a transaction happening around those wider benefits, BNG is enabling that as well. So that's where the design process actually works really, really well.
Great, thank you. We've still got 10 minutes left, so plenty of time for questions. Next one is up there somewhere. Yep, thank you.
Okay, thank you for the talk. My question is that would something like BNG in coming into legislation, would this be a problem moving forward that land developers and big corporations might continue, building stuff which is unsustainable and buying those credits on land which are on lease for 30 years, but those land developments would be there for more than 30 years. So what happens once the land use ends, and what happens to that unit of BNG that land developer had purchased, but that property still exists? So
yeah, I think it's a good question. So I think the recognition is that we need to build more homes in England, and so this policy is brought in to ensure that for every new house that's built, 110% is added. So you're actually adding biodiversity by building a house. Essentially, that's the concept, and I think that sort of concept is a great idea because we're adding biodiversity by building homes. Like you say, after 30 years, that is completely unknown. So I think in 30 years' time, it's a completely different landscape. And I'm sure something will exist as all of these BNG schemes start to come out of their agreement phase. I'm sure there will be some sort of income stream at that point to keep them over.
Okay.
Could I just add one more point to that is that in the delivery of BNG, when developments are put in for planning, they have to demonstrate that they've gone through a mitigation hierarchy. So the amount of off-site BNG units that they buy needs to have been minimised. They need to demonstrate that they've looked within their development boundary to provide that gain as well. Now, in most instances, it's probably not going to be possible for some of the bigger developments for them to do that. So there's that trade-off there.
Okay, thank you. I'm waiting for the next hand. Sir, if you could ask your question as loudly as you possibly can, because we don't. If anybody else has a question to follow from this gentleman, please come down to the front and he can have one of the microphones from the stage. Okay, so question after this gentleman, please come down to the front.
John Lockhart, Nicholson's Nurseries. It comes down to the simple question about additionality, and it's appeared in a couple of the answers to a couple of the questions. Can I sort of put to the panel, how do they feel this is going to be dealt with passing the baton from the public sector finance through to private sector finance? If somebody takes the public sector funding early doors, how are they going to be able to register a baseline that is going to allow them to justify the additionality in what they're doing and the ongoing costs of delivering those benefits after the going?
Who wants that?
Shall I have a go for a start?
Go.
And then maybe Matt, you've got something better to say. But essentially, I think so. For a start, we're advising all the farmers within the Environmental Farmers Group, for example, to go into SFI and government grant-funded schemes. At the moment, they've created it so that you can come out within a year from those schemes. So if you have a biodiversity net gain opportunity that suddenly appears, then you're able to get out of the government scheme and transition to the biodiversity. Those schemes, as I understand it, but don't quote me on it, are classified as arable or temporary arable, so they'll always revert back to the minimum baseline, essentially. And so you won't be penalised. Well, you won't plough it up, but you won't be penalised for not ploughing it up, if that makes sense.
From our perspective, we're trying to get all the baselines that we can, and then we can make a decision from there. So but SFI pay for soil testing, carbon, that's probably a minimum in this regard, but we're doing other tests for biodiversity and things like that as well. So hopefully we'll at least have the baseline for when opportunities that we want to leap on arrive.
We've still got time for two more questions, so shout loud.
On that baseline, we're a medium small farm on the Upper Medway in Sussex, really interested in baselining our farm, very little cash. I'm really interested in how you guys suggest that small individual farmers, we're looking to work with collaborative
what we did was, well, and we continue to do, is just look for all the opportunities that are out there. So through Wild Farm, we've had 3 different scientifically rigorous studies done. Then we've had various reports done for agroforestry reasons and for land use opportunities. They were free through the local authority, I think, or through a government agency. So just look for these sort of things. And I feel like there won't be an end to that in the near term. There'll be lots of these kind of things around. So yeah, just keep an eye out for them. Yeah. And then, like local groups that do bird watching, butterflies, bees, pollinators, anything like that, they could help you out in any way. Even if that's less scientifically rigorous, at least you've got something. So yeah, and they'll like it if they've got a lot of, biodiversity to look at. They might be used to just looking along a train line that's just full of gravel, and they might get the odd thing. But if you've got an area where there's an opportunity for lots of butterflies and bees and things, then that's positive for them as well.
So one thing I'd say is it also depends on what you're trying to baseline. So for BNG, the baseline, the habitat system, the categorization system is UKHAB, and it's a specific survey system which should really be undertaken. It should be undertaken by competent ecologists to do that, and that does cost money. But it gives you the assurance that if you go to someone and say, look, I have my baseline done and it's this competent ecologist has done it, then that's verifiable, and then you can take your project forward. It is a challenge, particularly for small farmers, to do that. And what we've done is try to think about things at scale. So how do we create, so we can create automated mapping? And there are other people who do that. I know the Land App have got something similar probably. But for our infrastructure clients, we can map at really large scale to get all of the habitat types mapped out. And then we'll focus our ecologists to go out on site to specific areas where there is the interest to get the kind of condition assessment done, which you need to form your baseline. I mean, I think there'd be some really interesting conversations in the future, maybe with EFG or with the Rivers and Wildlife Trust, as to how perhaps private organisations like ourselves can work with them to open up access to that kind of baselining in the future. And so we're always open to those conversations.
Us too.
Yeah. And that prompts me to say that there's websites out there such as Magic, which is, I think, a DEFRA, is that right? Yeah, a DEFRA website you can look at, you can get that kind of information that Matt's just talked about. And that's at least a start. Then the focus can be on very ground truthing in specific areas.
And that's a very good point for us to wrap up. I'm sorry, sir, I've just run out of time. But if you want to come down and talk to any of the panel afterwards, I'm sure they'll still be here for a little while afterwards. Thank you very much for your participation. And would you also thank the panel and Dave on sound? Thank you.